just to run through the contents of the session then. So as per the sign up that you would have accessed, we're going to look at how to express the benefits of your project. We're going to talk about making the case for support and what that means, where to look for funding, which is probably why a lot of you are here, the answer that you most want to know, what type of funding is out there and where to find it, how to plan and deliver your fundraising appeal, what works and what doesn't, and just some of our experience in relation to that. Hopefully there'll be time left for question and answer, and happy to field those, but it may be that there's time throughout to answer some questions as we go as well. So the first section, how to express the benefits of your project. And I want to start just by taking a little step to one side and just think about, what does a net zero carbon project look like exactly? Just going to give you some examples here. And this was a trial project at St Matthew's in Bristol. They had a problem of their building wasn't warm, and there was some new technology that they partnered with the company that have made the technology to trial it. And you can see two pictures there. One is the technology itself. It looks like a chandelier, but it's lighting and heating together, and it radiates infrared heat downwards directly onto the people sitting below. So that in that slightly colorized picture to the right of it, you can see all the heat is on the seats and not further above. And that project as a trial cost the church about £35,000, but before it was costing them £100 per service to heat their building, and afterwards it was costing them just £10 per session per service. And not only that, but somebody didn't have to turn up at 6 in the morning to turn the heating on for the room to get almost warm by the time the church congregation arrived, but actually they could turn it on 10 minutes before and the heat was instantly felt. So that's one example. This one, very different, very remote church, and in fact an off-grid church. This is a church that didn't have access directly to electricity and the like. So they previously had their roof fixed. They'd had back from the Victorian era gas lighting installed, so they replaced all of that. They put in photovoltaic, which is essentially kind of solar panels, and then for a total cost of £15,000, including the VAT and a bit of engineering costs, they sorted out all their lighting and their heating in one go to be fully renewable. Now, they were able to claim back most of the VAT, which was a refund of about £2,500. And after that, you know, they're self-sustainable as a church in terms of energy bills and the like. So quite different, but some similarities to the first project. Newcastle Cathedral, project size £6 million, probably a lot larger than the projects you're looking at, I suspect. And this was a reordering project, but as part of it, they said, let's sort out our heating and lighting too. So they were able to do it all in one go. They accessed funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. They installed air source heat pumps, underfloor heating, LED lighting, all that kind of stuff. And they're now monitoring their reduced energy bills to see what kind of savings they're making. So big scale, big impact for that cathedral. And then finally, this church, St Mark's in Harrogate, they installed solar panels for £24,000. They got a couple of grants, they got a feed-in tariff, and they're now benefiting from generating their own energy. But that project was part of a wider thing. They were part of the Eco Church network. So they were also setting up schemes that aren't traditionally what you think of as sort of a net zero capital project. They were tackling food poverty. They were tackling recycling through a project called Resurrection Bikes. So they were recycling old bikes and giving them to people who needed access to work and things. They have a clothes bank. And this church has really sort of taken a holistic approach to their environmental impact, which is another way of thinking about it too. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, if only there were more examples like this, and the diocese itself has put together a booklet, Saving Creation Church Case Studies Volume 1. Jemima will tell you later whether there's already a Volume 2. I'm not sure, but that's the one that was on their website. And what's helpful about reading about other examples is you can see what other churches are doing, what works, what doesn't work, and learn from their mistakes and their successes as you plan your own project, because it's quite apparent that there is no single definition of a net zero project, a net zero capital appeal. They all look slightly different, but they have commonalities, and it's good to learn from those. That website, the link is there, has a load of other really useful stuff. So we've got things like 6 Steps to Carbon Net Zero Churches Toolkit. Besides being a mouthful, that sounds like a really useful resource that you're going to be able to use, and perhaps you already have. Carbon Net Zero Parish Plan templates, webinars that you can access, how to measure your church's carbon footprint, tools, checklists, and the like. And it's all there, and it's all freely available. You might also be sitting there thinking, yeah, but what has this got to do with fundraising? It's great to see other examples, but I'm here to learn about how to fundraise for my project. So that's a great question. And let's move on with that. With a question, how would you raise funds for this church in the picture? Maybe it looks like your church, maybe it looks quite different. Or maybe it's one of the projects in the case studies, or it's your project yourself. How do you go about raising funds for a church project like that? More to the point, why would any funder or donor give to your project? They've got a lot of demand on their funds. There's a lot of places they could give money to. Why would they give it to your project? Why would they give it to your PCC to deliver the project? And those are the questions that we have to grapple with, and we have to be able to answer confidently if we're going to raise funds for our net zero project. The answer is building your case for support, which isn't fundraising, and at the same time is part of fundraising. We say there are 2 foundational approaches to fundraising. You start with answering the question why. It's easy when you're planning a project, when you're in the throes of the project, to be so focused on the how. How are we going to tackle this problem? What are the things that we've got to do? And we get focused on the solutions, whether it is underfloor heating, whether it's figuring out, is it solar panels? What is the solution? We get focused on the how. We need to go back and we need to start with the why. Why do we need to do this? Why is it important? The second foundation is, surprise, surprise, it's not about you, it's about the donor. Of course, it is about you, because you're going to benefit from the project. You're going to benefit from the long-term change that you achieve. But in fundraising, we're trying to make that case to other people. We're trying to get them to part with their money and to send it our way. So we have to think about it from the point of view of the donor and what makes them tick. So we're going to think through some of these things, what that means for your project. Hopefully, after this session, you're going to go away and start to reflect some of this in your own particular situation, and build up your case for support. So we start here. We start with questions like, why? Why this project? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing it now? Why is it us that's doing this? Why should the donor care? And there's lots of different ways to answer that question. And it's going to be important to consider those. What are we going to achieve? How much money do we need? Starting to answer those questions when you start fundraising is the worst time, because suddenly you're filling in application forms, you're speaking to people, and you're not so much inventing it on the go, but you're potentially not having thought through the rationale, and therefore are not able to make the best case possible. And in a lot of cases, you're going to get one chance to make that case. You're going to get one chance to present the case for funding your project. So you've got to get it right. So what makes for a good why? What makes for a good why in the context of a net zero project? If I was the Right Reverend Nick Baines, Bishop of Leeds, I might say our saving creation strategy encourages us to grow in discipleship, reframe our living together, and reshape the way we see our commitment to God and each other. And that's a theological why in a lot of ways. It's a how do we turn our theology into practice as the Church of England, as churches, as congregations. And that's a good why. That's going to convince some people, I'm sure, to support your project. If I was a politician, how would I view it? Barack Obama said, we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. That's ouch. That's quite serious stuff, really. But, a politician is going to think about it from a different perspective to somebody who has care for God's creation in mind. So it's important to think that through. What might an environmentalist say? Quote from Greta Thunberg: avoiding climate breakdown will require cathedral thinking. That's quite relevant for our session today. We must lay the foundation while we may not know exactly how to build the ceiling. You might be at the start of your project and you might be feeling a bit like that. We know the foundation is to do something about our energy supply, about our insulation. don't know exactly how to get there. There's a lot of options that we've got to consider, and how do we know which ones? But that's also in the context of, why would a funder fund your church? What difference is having your church net zero going to make in the grand scheme of things when we're hearing about climate change? And it's thinking through how we make that bigger case, how we position our church within that bigger context. Maybe I'm the PCC member who's responsible for the finances, and maybe I'm thinking generating our own electricity will save a fortune in annual energy bills. And maybe it's that simple. And that's quite a compelling case for the church. Why should we invest big sum now? Well, because it will pay dividends in the long term, and it's going to save us money in the long term, and probably pay itself off at some point too. Or maybe I'm the congregation member who's just sitting there saying it'll be nice not to have to wear our coats, hats and scarves just to be warm in July. And you might be nodding to that. Again, that might be the compelling case. All of those are relevant. What might the funder say? Every pound spent now will have vastly more impact on limiting the damage of climate change than a pound spent in 10 years' time. That's a very pragmatic thought process there. And in fundraising, we appeal to the head and to the heart. And that quote from the congregation member is very much appealing to the heart. You want to be warm. And the quote below from in the context of funders is very much head. There's a logic to doing this work now and saving money for the long term. What is your why going to be for your project? And how are you going to present that? And of course, it's not going to be a single why, because we're going to start thinking about the different people that you're presenting to, the different potential funders and donors, and understanding their why and connecting with that. So expressing why is a foundation for fundraising. A strong case for support will enable you to communicate why the project is important, to whom it's important, not just your congregation, but others in your community, what difference it will make, and how you know this to be true. And all of this stuff is important because although it's not fundraising in the classic sense, it's building up your credibility, it's building up your competence to be able to talk about this stuff to funders. I always talk about it in terms of fundraising is about trust. People trust you with their money. That's what you're trying to achieve. And competence and credibility build trust. You're not going to have a relationship with a lot of these funders. You might with members of your congregation who might donate to the project, but for a lot of them, they don't know you. There's no relationship there. So how can they trust you? And being able to present a strong case for support gives them a sense of these guys, they've got credibility, they've done their homework, they understand what the needs are, they're competent, they've given us a bit of their track record and their understanding. That helps me to trust them. That means I'm going to give them the funding rather than someone else. So we go back to our old cold church building and we think about all of those things in relation to this. How can we show that you've understood the problem? Well, environmental audits of your church building are going to be a really important precursor to your fundraising. Energy audits that explain how much energy you're using now, what your carbon footprint is, and what might be different if you adopt new technology, if you solve some of the problems that are making the building cold, possibly damp and uninviting. No doubt for a lot of that kind of stuff, you're going to be accessing expert advice because it's technical information. It's things that you probably can't do yourself, and that's okay. And keeping track of that, keeping a record of that is going to bolster your fundraising because you can say to the funders and donors, we haven't made this up. We engaged the advice of such and such expert. Here's the report they wrote. Here's what it tells us. Here's why we've chosen. We've considered our options. Here's why we've chosen to do A, B, and C and not X, Y, and Z. And even if your church building project isn't anything to do with net zero, we still recommend that churches talk to funders about their options appraisal. Okay, if you wanted to put a new toilet and a new kitchen, did you consider where it might go and what the different options are and what led you to choose the one that you chose, to show that you've thought it through. You've not just gone for the first option. That's going to be relevant, particularly as a lot of the funders and donors don't really understand the technology either. They often don't understand the issues either. So what you're doing is you're filling in the gaps for them, saying we've done our homework, we understand it, we're interpreting for you to explain why we know this is the right project. You might also talk about any, we've said here, ecologically recognized, anything you're doing around eco-church awards. If you haven't connected with that resource, now's the time to do so. Hopefully it's not new to you You might even be at bronze, silver, or gold level yourselves. And what, again, that says to funders is you're taking this seriously. It's not just about the building, it's about the wider community, it's about your congregation and the things that you're doing, the choices that you're making, the changes that you're making for the long term. And again, that just gives the church a sense of this, the funder a sense of this isn't an opportunistic project to do up the building. This is part of the congregation's wider commitment to tackling climate change. And again, when we talk about community, there are two dynamics with the church. There's your church community, your congregation, and no doubt they'll be involved in some of the planning and some of the consultation, but it's also important that you consult the community. I'm going to talk a bit about what that looks like later on in the session. Being able to evidence that you've talked to the community about what they think of your building, what they think of the changes that you're planning, how it will affect and impact them is a really important part of your fundraising, of your preparation for fundraising. So we've produced a free resource. We've called it, catchy name, Your Net Zero Carbon Appeal Needs a Case for Support. Here's why and what to do about it. And that is now uploaded on the Diocese website, possibly not in that link. And so what we're going to do when we send you these slides, we'll make sure that link is up to date. I may have put the wrong one in. Case for support is kind of art and science. The artistic side is identifying your why. Why is this important? And the science side to it is gathering the evidence that you need. And it can be quite complex. It's not something we can talk through in full detail in a session like this, but we thought what's going to be a helpful resource for churches who really just want to be walked through the process. So we have created a resource that helps you identify and refine your why for your building, anticipate some of the funder and donor questions and prepare to answer them, links to resources that will help you compile your case for support, consideration of how your green credentials fit into that fundraising picture, and then all of that's wrapped up into a template, a Word document that you can start to fill in information and gather it together. And we hope that's going to be really helpful to churches as they embark on their projects. It may even be that you're a little bit further on with your project, you've got some of this information, you've just not got it in one place and you want to sort of start filling in our template. It may be that you've got that all covered and you don't need to use our template. That's absolutely fine. But essentially we've got, here's some example of some of the content that we've got there, really one step at a time, how you go through it, what it means and how to do it for yourselves. And I've just put this slide in because, as I've said a couple of times, this isn't fundraising, but I remember many years ago watching a Formula One race, and the commentator made an interesting comment. He said something like, "This race will be won in the pit lane." And what he was saying was, we often think of Formula One and sports like that is being about the driver. How good is the driver? They're the one that win or lose the race. But the point he was making is they need a support team around them, and actually how they set the car up before the race is really important. How they conduct the pit stops during the race and when they have the pit stops is really important. And the driver can't actually win the race without those things being right. So all of this preparation stuff is setting you up in the best possible position for your fundraising, so that when you start going with raising funds, with communicating your project externally beyond the church, you're ready, everything is set up and good to go, and you stand a much better chance of winning the race, of achieving your appeal target. So we'll have that in mind as we go through other bits of the session, but we're ready to move on to the next step. Are there any, Janet, were there any points to interject at this point?
No, we're fine to carry on, Sean. There's no questions.
Great. Okay. Great. Okay. So if you have questions as you go, feel free to pop those in. Janet will try and answer those, and then we can field them at the end too. But I'm aware that I'm imparting a lot of information, and you're probably listening to that as well. Where to look for funding? What type of funding is out there, and where to find it? So last year, I can say that now because we're into the new year, Action Planning worked with the Church of England nationally on its net zero strategy. And we were asked to come in and provide advice around fundraising for net zero. This is an ambitious goal for the whole estate of the Church of England to be net zero by 2030. And that's thousands of buildings, but it's not just church buildings, obviously. It's cathedrals, it's offices, it's housing, it's educational institutions, and more besides. So, you know, that's going to be expensive. It's going to cost a lot of money. And the Church of England wanted to know centrally, how do we raise that money? We did a big piece of work, me and colleagues of mine, a piece of work called a fundraising feasibility study, which just tries to answer the question, where's the money and how do we get it, basically? So we looked into a wide range of funding opportunities, and not just the live opportunities, but the kind of types of funding that might be available in the future to try and answer that question. How did we answer the question? It's difficult to give a definitive answer, but what it resulted in was our ability to say, yes, there's money available now, there will be money available in the future, there's an election coming up, that's going to affect things, but what we can do is identify how to resource the fundraising, and then we made some recommendations about how to do that. And we're very excited. This year, we're going to be working nationally with the Church of England to support individual churches across the country to do their fundraising for their net zero project. For the past 6 months, I've been working with Janet and Jemima and their colleagues at Leeds Diocese, doing that similar piece of work, but on a smaller level for a single diocese, and trying to work out what does it look like. And it's been a really interesting process. Again, there aren't always definitive answers with these things, but it has helped us to identify the types of funding that are going to be relevant. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about types of funding and then provide some examples of funding opportunities that are out there, but also more importantly, point you at the resources that are going to enable you to find those funds for yourself. Because if you're not ready to fundraise today, or maybe in 6 months' time, or maybe a year down the line, some of the funding opportunities now will not still be available. But the ability to find them and to know where to find them is what's going to make the difference in you accessing those funds. So we talked about first foundation of fundraising is why. Why is this project important? And the second foundation is it's not about you, it's about the donor. The donor is going to come from one of only 5 sources of funding for the charity sector. And we say that sometimes in our training courses, we say, how many sources of funding do you think are out there? And people sort of guess and give ideas, but we always say there's only 5 possible sources, only 5 places that you can go to get charitable funding. Now, I've put a little disclaimer there on my slide. There are technically more than 5, but they're not all about fundraising. I'll explain what that means. But it's worth you just having in mind 5 sources, and I'm going to run through what they are. The first one, no particular order, but the first one I'm going to reference here is people. People give to charity. People can represent your congregation who already give to your church on a regular basis. In the past may have given exceptional sums for other building projects and the like, and demonstrated their generosity. They're inside, they are the people closest to you, but there's also your neighbours, and neighbours might be people who live around your church building. It might be other businesses or other community groups that live around you. And I've even put your fans. Your fans are people who may not be part of your congregation, but they may love your church building. They may have a history as themselves or their family because they've been to weddings there, they've been to funerals there. And they may never consider themselves a Christian, but they might nevertheless support your building. The famous story we like to tell, we don't take credit for it, but we were told it by a church that we were working with. They were raising money for their church spire. They were knocking on doors, asking people to donate. And one gentleman said, well, yeah, before you say anything more, I'll get my checkbook. And they didn't really have to do much to convince him. He wrote a check for them there and then and there, quite a reasonable size check. And he said, the reason is because that view of the spire from my house adds value to my property. And it was something as simple as that calculation of the location of his church, the view that he had every morning when he woke up. And even though he wasn't a member of the church, he was willing to support the church spire appeal. So people are going to be really important to your fundraising appeal. Grant makers, many of them are charities themselves run by trustees. So they're quite similar in how they're set up and run to church or PCC and other charities that you might be involved in. And they exist to give money out. They have money invested to give to charitable causes. At any one time, there's about 10,000 active in the UK giving out grants, but they're all giving to different things. So most of them won't be interested in your project, I'm sorry to say. Competition is very fierce because there are lots of people applying, trying to get money out of them for projects. They are going to be an important part of your capital appeal, almost certainly, but it's always tempting to think, we're going to fund our project through grants. The money's out there, we're going to do that. And we have lots of conversations. Churches speak to us, making inquiries about what we do. And they sometimes say, well, this is all going to be funded through grants. And a lot of the time we're saying to them, it probably isn't actually, but that's okay. We can help you to maximize what you can get from grants, but also look at other sources that are going to be available to you. Number 3, statutory bodies, tax-funded local government, national government, health bodies and the like. And sometimes they give money to the charity sector, to other sectors, and it's always about how can we connect with their public agendas, because they are publicly funded through taxation, so they have to be responsible for how they distribute money and how they spend money. Therefore, they're going to give out grants or funding to achieve one of their objectives. And if you can understand what those objectives are, and sometimes think a little bit outside the box about your project and how it meets some of those objectives, then you may be able to access some statutory funding for your project. Private business, that might be national or international companies, it might be local businesses that are just down the road from you. And they don't exist to give money away, they exist to make money for somebody or for shareholders or something. But as you know, businesses, companies do give out money to charities and to good causes and to local projects and the like, often because they want to be a good neighbor. They want to be a good part of their local community. They want to engage their staff in their community because they perceive the goodness that comes from that. And again, what's in it for them? If they're going to fund your church net zero capital appeal, is there some link that you can make that's going to make them feel like it's a good investment of essentially their profits? Number 5, we've got communities, and they kind of span all those things. Everybody in 1 to 4 in some way that's involved in those is going to be involved in your community in some way as well. So we're always a little bit mindful of double counting when we come to working out how much money comes from communities. If you go to your local ASDA and you fill in the form that says, would you support our project? And then people take their green token and decide where they're going to put it. And then the winner gets a bit of money. Is that corporate private business fundraising, or is that community fundraising? It's probably a little bit of both, in fact. And because the people who are going to make the choices are individuals who are putting that green token in, they're people too. So all of these things interrelate. On the whole, when we talk about community fundraising, we are thinking about Village Fete that raises some money, making jam, baking cakes to sell, doing a sponsored run, all of those things that are sort of lots of work, sometimes for a seemingly small financial gain. But what's important is it gives your community a chance to be involved in the project. It raises hard cash, which is useful for your project. It raises friends, actually, as well. It lets people know about what you're doing and maybe part of your wider vision for your church in your community. So we never ignore that. We just talk about what's the right time to do it and what's the right way to do it. 6 there, I've put also loans and trading. And I said there were technically more than 5 contributors to your project. It may be that you look at loan funding for your project, particularly if you are installing some kind of net zero technology that will make money in the long term, either making money by saving money, so you can use that money to pay off the loan, or a feed-in tariff for energy generation, where you're receiving money for feeding in your excess energy. That might be a reason to take a loan either from a bank or from individuals. Trading is another form of fundraising in a way that you might engage with, but it's not strictly fundraising, so we're not going to get too focused on them, but they'll come up again a bit later when we talk about planning process. So, okay, so what does it look like? What are these? How do these come together in a typical project? And I say typical in inverted commas because there's no such thing as a typical project, but this is what we find from some of our experience. And I took this this visual from a colleague of mine. He uses this. He talks about an ideal scenario or maybe a typical scenario. And he thinks about the different types of funding. On the left there, we've got church, and he's put their pump prime. And what that means is the money that's up front, the upfront investment in the project. He's talked about reserves. The church may have reserves in hand saved for building development or saved for a rainy day. And maybe this project is part of that rainy day and solving a problem. Legacies, maybe that you've received money to invest in the building in some way, and that money is now available to be used. Could be a congregational appeal, a giving Sunday towards your building. It could be other assets that you've got. It might be that the church owns a property, and now's the time to sell that property to invest in your building. Who knows? It's complex decisions to be made, but they make up this kind of initial bulk of money. You may have money for your project. You may say, we haven't got any of that stuff. We've got to look all external. And that's okay. It's about what is your project going to look like. The blue section in the middle, we've got those external sources, grants, major donors from outside the church. CIL stands for Community Infrastructure Levy, which is a type of statutory funding, which we'll talk about in a bit. And corporates, those private business entities, and they're going to make a contribution too. And then we've got public, kind of community, whether it's crowdfunding, if you know what crowdfunding is, or if you don't know what crowdfunding, it's kind of getting money from lots of different people who may not be directly connected with you. We've even put jam sales there, something quite basic, people rolling their sleeves up and getting involved and doing something. And as you can see, there are different size sections for different groups of funders there. If we put some numbers to this, if we say, let's imagine an appeal of £250,000, yours might be smaller, yours might be bigger, yours might be just around that. This isn't what it must look like. This is just what we find they often end up looking a bit like once the fundraising is done and people look back on where did the money come from. And that first section in yellow, that church appeal, that funds already in hand, maybe a small legacy, might typically make up around a third of your total. In a £250,000 appeal, a third would be about £85,000. And that's that pump prime. That's saying we're not starting from scratch, we're part of the way there. Grants for a project of that size might look like about £100,000 once you've researched the funders, once you've written your applications, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. And then major donors, possibly individuals or a local company, might put in another £25,000. And then the local authority might have some community infrastructure levy funding available of about £10,000. Probably once you put all those things together, you're going to be almost 90% of the way there with your fundraising, leaving the public crowdfunding and the jam sales to make up the last 10 to 12% or so. Quite how many jars of jam you have to sell to make £30,000, I don't know, but it's indicative of that kind of final 10% push that needs to be achieved. So we have that in mind when we're planning our fundraising, and we talk to churches about that so they get a sense of it's probably not going to be grants 100%. It's going to have to be a bit of a mix, and we'll talk a bit later about what it looks like for your project and how do you know, how do you work this stuff out before you've done any of your fundraising. So you're going to want to identify your funding mix. You're going to want to identify what we call your prospect pool. If your prospects are the people that might give you money, then your prospect pool is that kind of whole group and who they are and how you access them and what you say to them. Starting with your funds already identified, yes, the reserves, the pledges, the gifts from your congregation, etc. Bearing in mind that the grant funders might say, we won't even accept an application from you until you've got 30%. Or maybe 50%, or maybe sometimes 80%, which means, well, I can't apply to them until further down the line. I've got to get these other sources organized and in place before I can even write some of these applications. And the principle that you start with the potential donors and funders that are closest to you and you work out. So I sometimes talk about a bullseye, you know, imagine you're doing archery or something and you want to get as close to the center as you can. In the center, probably the people closest to you are your congregation. And technically, they're the easiest people to ask for money. They're a captive audience, if you like. So asking them to support you financially is relatively a straightforward thing to do. Local businesses, local grant funders are probably quite easy to do because they've seen your church building. They've probably been there for weddings, for funerals, for community events. So it's quite easy to talk to them about your project. It's much harder in some ways to approach the national funder, even the national funder that says we support local community church buildings with net zero projects. You've still got to say, well, okay, we need to tell you all about who we are and what we do and why this project and why now and why it's important and what difference it will make. So that's a little bit harder. Even harder to find the donor who might give you a large check towards your project but has never been to your village. Why would they support you? It's much harder to raise funds from them. So you start closest to you and you work outwards, and that way you've got the best chance of getting that initial support, that initial lump sum of investment in your project before you then go out to others further afield. So who are these funders? Where do we find them? How do we find people that are going to support us? Yes, you are going to look at your congregation's giving history and what you can learn from this. So we're doing a piece of work with the church at the moment who said, would you research the grants? Yeah, of course we can do that. And then they said, well, our project is X amount, forget, a couple of million, I think. Can you tell us how much we can raise from other sources too? Oh, that's a bit harder, actually. And so we've said to them, you need to give us a load of background information. We need to know how much your congregation is giving month in, month out, year in, year out. But we also need to know, have they given to building projects for your church in the past? Because that might give us an indication of how they would give now. And so we sort of consider what we know already, what the church knows already, and what we learn from it. Absolutely do involve people in planning the project. And Eco Church is a great place to start there, as we've already said, because it gets people thinking about their own lives and what difference they make, what impact climate change has on their lives, which makes them more likely to think, well, I can make a change. I can maybe do some stuff in my transport, in my own home, but I can also help my church community to be a better steward of creation. When you are doing a church giving appeal, do invite gifts up front, but also invite pledges. And I'll talk about this in a bit, the idea that somebody might be able to give you 100, 1,000, 10,000 pounds now. A lot of people won't, but they might be able to give you 10,000 pounds or 1,000 pounds over 3 to 5 years. So they can pledge that they're going to do that and they can give it a bit at a time. And that's really, really important. We say don't start by asking your congregation members for personal loans. A gift doesn't have to be repaid, a loan does. Now, we hear churches tell us, well, a couple of years down the line, they'll probably just give us the money anyway. And that will be okay, but we know we might have to repay it. Well, ask for a gift up front, and people may do that. If you ask them for a loan, that may be their preferred option, and it may not be in your interests. So that's the recommendation that we make. And certainly don't rely on cold contact with millionaires, as I've already said. Look, if you can't identify a strong link to Richard Branson or whoever it might be in mind, if they have no strong link to your church or your building or your congregation in the past or the present, assume they've got no interest in funding your project. And at some point, somebody is going to say the throwaway comment of, oh, we just need a Richard Branson or something. That's fine, but who are these people? Where are they? And how do you access them? So don't rely on those. Focus on what you can do, focus on what you know, and build up from there. What about the grant makers? Who are they? Well, fortunately, your diocese has resources available to you. We've helped them to produce a couple of funding directories. One is called the Net Zero Carbon Projects Directory. There are 115 grant funders in there and 7 loan opportunities. Another is called Environment and Sustainability Directory. There's 26 pages of grant funding opportunities. That one in itself is drawn from a bigger resource from the Church of England, which is, again, a printed directory, a downloadable directory of funding opportunities. Funders are out there. A list of who to look for is good in some ways. It means you don't have to do some of the technical research. You're just reading through a document that you can download in your own home and sift through it and work out, are these funders good for us or not? The information's there, but there's often a website that you can link to for the funder itself, and they'll tell you the up-to-date information, and they'll be able to tell you what they're looking for and also give you examples of what they've funded in the past. So those directories are a way to directly identify the funders of your project. There's another resource called the Diocese of Manchester, Chester and Leeds for Community. Now, essentially, those three dioceses got together. They approached the iDocs company who produce an online searchable directory, and they said, would you do something that's quite specific to us? And then they make it available to, I believe, any churches in the Diocese of Manchester, Chester and Leeds for free. So you can access that. You can create your own login and you'll speak to the diocese about this. They'll be able to tell you if there's a specific login or you create your own. Either way, what that gives you access to is a searchable online database with examples on the website of how to do it yourself. Essentially, you're putting in some key terms: church building project, your location, the kind of technologies that you might need to install. You hit go, and a live list of current funding opportunities will come back at you with information about who those funders are. The benefit of that over the static directories that we've produced is they're updated a bit more frequently, probably. But equally, yeah, there's a bit of grappling around. And if you don't feel like you're good with the technology side of things on websites and the like, that's okay. Use the static directories. There's another one called Church Grants. A friend of Action Planning builds that and runs it. Again, it's a searchable online database of funders that specifically like to fund church buildings and church projects and the like. So quite a narrow field of very specialist funders that you can access. Now, I've put a star next to that because I believe Church Grants is in conversation with the Church of England nationally about possibly making that available for free to churches at this time. But your diocese will receive information about that if it goes live. So watch this space. So a range of ways that you can find funding. It would be easy for me just to say, oh, here's some names of funders. But the reality is not every funder is going to be relevant for every project. And even if they were, you'd still have to visit the website and just read through the guidance on when to apply, how to apply, what information do and don't they want, what deadlines do they have. So I'm a little bit hesitant just to start giving names of funders. What I have done is given examples of grants, and this is from some of the research that we did for the diocese. And it just gives you an examples of the types of funding opportunities that are out there in the charitable grants funding world. The Aviva Climate Fund. Aviva is an insurance company. I think they used to be the Norwich Union insurance company. And they have an online match funding, crowdfunding opportunity. But they're interested in projects that are dealing with climate action, promoting healthy, thriving communities by preventing, preparing for, and protecting against the impacts of climate change. Now, that sounds like most of the projects that I would imagine you are planning and running. So that might be a good place to start. Because it's crowdfunding, it's also going to need to engage your community. So it's a win-win because you're finding opportunities to talk to your community, invite them to make donations. And I believe the Climate Fund then match funds it from the central pot as well. So that's a good potential opportunity for you to look at. You may have heard of the Garfield Weston Foundation, one of the largest UK grant makers. They fund a wide range of things generally, and they fund a lot of church building projects that are not climate change related, not net zero related. But that is a definite interest of theirs, and they're likely to be a funder that churches will be approaching for their projects. The Liz and Terry Bramall Foundation is a great example of living philanthropists who set up a foundation to distribute their wealth, some of their wealth, as opposed to something like the Garfield Weston, where it was set up, a few generations ago. So the Bramall Foundation's objects include the advancement of the Christian faith, tick, for the benefit of the public in accordance with the statements of belief of the Church of England, tick. And they're also interested in the protection or conservation of the environment, tick. So this is the kind of ways that you're starting to do your own research and starting to find funders. You're looking for some of these key terms and thinking, is there a connection? Is there a link between our project and what the funder's trying to achieve? If you can find those links, there's a good chance you can apply. If you are really struggling to find those links, don't waste your time, don't waste the funder's time. On an off chance, chances are you won't get funded and it'll be a waste of their time. The MSc Foundation works to raise public confidence, awareness, and access to renewable energy and low carbon solutions. So again, we're seeing some good links potentially with your projects. And these funders are out there, they've got funding programs now, they've got a lot of money to give, and they're oversubscribed often in terms of the amounts that are being asked of them. That's where your case for support comes in. You do your homework first, you prepare your case, you make it as strong as possible, you make it easy for the funder to say, yes, we will support your project. Just some screen grabs of the static directories that you can download from the website, just so that you've got a sense of what they look like. So I won't focus on that too much. Statutory bodies, national government, regional and local government, and bearing in mind that the boundaries for local and regional government often don't correlate well with the diocese. So you might be looking, depending where you are, you might be looking to access statutory funding from North Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, Lancashire, even Cumbria. And there shouldn't be a problem that your Diocese of Leeds funder, the statutory body, probably doesn't care about that. They're more interested in your postcode to know if you're in their patch and therefore able to access the funding. Also, potentially health bodies, local enterprise partnerships, Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. How is my project having any impact on police and crime, you might say? Well, you'd be surprised that how providing community facilities that are warm and welcoming, have health benefits, have benefits for wider society that the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office may have an interest in supporting. So sometimes we're thinking a little bit outside the box and not shoehorning our project into a funding opportunity, nevertheless thinking, what are the wider implications of our project and how do we talk about that? A case for support, our why for a project. You want to present your project in terms of, yes, environmental impact, but also community impact, sustainability impact, and you want to align it with the published strategic opportunities and priorities. Some councils increasingly are declaring a climate emergency as a way of saying, we recognise this is a big deal, and actually we need to focus our resources and our decision making in that context. So that's an opening for you to talk about your project and how you help to provide a solution. Some examples quickly for that might be relevant to Diocese of Leeds and churches within that. West Yorkshire Energy Price Emergency Grants available to help small and medium-sized enterprises in West Yorkshire region to help meet the cost of energy efficiency improvements. That sounds like a bit of a tick for some of your projects. Applications will be accepted from small and medium-sized enterprises with fewer or 50 employees. So potentially, if you are in that right location, something you could look into. The Yorkshire Dale Millennium Trust Grants Programme, grants available for these voluntary sector, community enterprise groups, public bodies and businesses in the Yorkshire Dales National Park or Nidderdale Area of Natural Beauty to deliver projects. So again, you know, how wider work, not just thinking about solar panels, not just thinking about internal heating, but possibly your churchyard, how you increase biodiversity in your local area, and can you access funding for that too? Ripon City Council Small Grants Scheme, local charitable and community organisations for projects and activities which benefit the residents of Ripon. Community Ownership Fund, this is a central government fund, and it's not just about community ownership, even though that's what the name says. It also covers the upgrade of community buildings, which can include churches. And there is an emphasis on energy conservation and sustainability of community facilities. So a mix of live opportunities as they are now, and those opportunities change quite regularly. So you have to be on the ball. Where to look for these? The UK government website has a section called Find Government Grants. That looks like a great place to start, if you ask me. However, it might well be that that covers everything from, you know, national multi-million-pound grants for national projects, as well as smaller scales. So you might have to do a lot of sifting through those to find ones that are relevant for you. Your local authority website will probably have a search function. I usually just put in terms like grants or funding or community funding and see what that pulls up. And in any case, you want to be speaking to your councillors, your MP, who you can talk to about your project and why, the why of your project, why it's important, because it's important to you and your community. Therefore, by definition, it's important to your councillors and your MP to know about these projects. And they are well used to being asked, is there any funding available? And it is their job to know what funding is available and to be able to say, yeah, apply to this, apply to that. So they're a great resource. And of course, your diocese itself. Other charitable bodies like community foundations, councils for voluntary service will be very up to speed on statutory funding opportunities because it's part and parcel of what they do and the world in which they inhabit. And then just get on your favorite web browser and do some web searches for statutory funding for your local area, for net zero projects, and you'll be surprised what that pulls up. Private business funders. So what we find for most church capital appeals, net zero and non-net zero, contributions from private business tend to look like one of a few things. It's match giving schemes for employee fundraising. So a local employer that says, if one of our staff raises £50, we'll give £50. They're trying to encourage community-minded people to raise funds locally, and they'll match it. Local donation schemes, I mentioned about the ASDA token in the box earlier. Your local supermarket, it's kind of part of community fundraising, but again, the money is coming from, so it comes under this too. And not uncommon for an individual business owner to say, I want to give money to this project, but I want to give it through my company, through my business, rather than individually. And that might be for tax purposes or not. So that's another way that we find private business gives. What we find less frequently is, the large companies sponsoring a church project. It probably wouldn't make sense anyway. You wouldn't want their logos on your building necessarily. So, however, there might be opportunities for, on the wider scale, the diocese itself to broker corporate support across a range of projects, to be able to say, look, we've got 10 churches, would you fund those as a bigger package? And that may be a role to be played. And it's all about thinking what's in it for the donor. They might want some public recognition in your local community. They might want to test technology like that early case study that we saw, where they can get some real world evidence of what works and what doesn't. They might just want to take part in what we call greenwashing, which is, we're not a very environmentally sustainable company. Let's support some environmental projects so that we look good, and then we can carry on doing what we're doing. And certain oil companies have been accused of that from time to time. So you have to think about, do you have an ethical stance on that? What's important to your PCC and your community in the bigger picture? It is harder to research company giving that is going to be relevant for your project. So we don't have a lot of resources. What we are saying is community mapping is a good place to start. And I'm going to talk about community mapping after I've talked a bit about community fundraising. First, I'm going to plug in my own laptop because it's telling me the battery is getting low. That's done. So do's and don'ts of community fundraising. Don't make fundraising your community's first involvement in your project. The last thing you want is that the first thing your community hears from you is, give us some money for our project. Do involve them in planning the project in the bigger picture. Listen to their concerns and their ideas and feedback. That is all evidence that you can give to funders to say, this is for our community, and we know what bothers them and what's important to them and what they need, and here's the evidence for that. Do let them fundraise for you. They can raise money for you without you lifting a finger. However, do ensure that they are on message. So, possibly provide information for them. If you've ever done sponsored run or something for a large charity, you'll probably get your pack through the post that says, here's some ideas and tips on how to raise money from your friends. And it helps you to be on message. So you may want to produce something like that. You might also want to avoid them from fundraising activities which are not particularly environmentally friendly, environmentally sustainable, because that might undermine your net zero project that you're trying to achieve. Don't start community fundraising too early in your appeal. Community fundraising will generally raise small amounts of money from a large effort. So focusing on that final stretch. When my parents' church were raising money, I think my parents got sick of fish and chips because they just had endless fish and chip dinners, because that was a fundraising mechanism. Fun at first, but eventually not so good. And when you start too early, you spend longer raising community funds. Being able to say, we're 80% of the way there. Now, community, will you now help us raise the last 10 or 20% that we need? And that galvanizes your community. Keep them updated on progress, keep them updated on news and developments and celebrations. The worst thing is people giving and then feeling like, well, I don't know where my money's gone. I can't see anything happening. And just keeping them updated on progress is a great way to avoid. I'm talking to you about this. You guys are probably the masters of community fundraising because it's probably something that you do a lot in your church anyway. So just a quick think about community mapping and community audit. And again, that may be something you're aware of, maybe quite new to you, but it's simply about working out what assets are already in our community. And that includes the congregation, your neighbours, the local businesses, community groups, local services, local residents, etc., even the tourist trade. It's important to understand these because it helps you to pinpoint the contribution that your church building and your church community makes to that community. It also helps you to explain to funders your picture in your ecosystem and why that's important. And you can do that through some online research. I often, if I'm doing it for a church, the first place I'll go to is a mapping service with a bird's eye view, and I'll just look around the map and I'll think, oh, what can I find? There's a scout hut, and there's a village hall, and there's the local school. That's quite an easy way. And then, of course, that's supplemented with local knowledge. A lot of you will know what's in your community and be involved as members of the School Governors Association, etc. Then you can look at, do some online searches for your local authority. They often produce something called a strategic needs assessment or a community strategy, which will tell you what they think is important in the community. And you can start to work out, well, they're saying that community buildings are important, and we know that we're the only one. Oh, that's us then. We can help to solve a problem that they've got and play our part in the community. Don't forget local funding bodies, because if there is a grant funder locally to you, they've got a vested interest in supporting your project, most likely, and will be happy to do so. When it comes to consultation, asking people about your church building and its place in their community, about their needs and their challenges, what they want to see in the community, about your plans as you have them, listening and responding to those through surveys, leaflet drops, drop-ins and open days. Again, a great way to evidence to funders what's important to your community and why you're doing this project and what difference it will make. Okay, and then reviewing and analysing the evidence. What is it telling you? How does it shape your plans? And certainly, funders, when they say what consultation have they done, they don't just want to say, we got X number of survey responses. They want to hear, well, last July, we had an open day that was attended by 50 people, and this is what we found out. And then in the autumn, we did a leaflet drop of 1,000 leaflets, and then this is what we got back. And it helps them to get a picture that you're working hard to really understand your community. All of this is relevant for any kind of capital appeal. And guess what? It's still relevant for your net zero capital appeal. It's the same principles, and they need to not be forgotten or overlooked. So how do we plan and deliver our fundraising appeal? What works and what doesn't in practice? And how do we pull all this stuff together? As I've said already, the Church of England has compiled, yes, an impressive and comprehensive range of resources that are being added to month in, month out, including fundraising advice. So we do recommend EcoChurch if you're not already engaged. We recommend, yes, rooting your environmental improvements, your project planning in the context of your quinquennial inspections. What else does the building need at this time? Let's not just focus on the now, but let's think how it impacts upon the next 3 to 5 years. Your environmental audit, that's really important, and your mission action plan if you have one, which converts the use of the building into a resource for that wider community and what you want to achieve in your community. Use the free Case for Support Builder resource that I mentioned earlier. Links available. You can download that off the diocese website. That will help you to gather your evidence. And even controversial, try not to raise environmental funding. Try not to just think about your project as, oh, okay, this is about net zero, so we can only apply to environmental funders. Okay, yes, access what environmental funding opportunities are available from statutory sources, from grant-making trusts. Yes, talk about it in your communications to individual donors. The why behind this is about climate change and mitigating that, but also making our building more welcoming. Show the non-environmental funders why they should still support your net zero project, because it has that benefit to your community on the wider picture. Talk about how your project fits in with the bigger picture of the Church of England commitment to net zero. If you want a riveting read, the route map to net zero carbon by 2030 is a downloadable document from the Church of England. It's long, but it's fascinating in terms of how nationally the church is going to respond to this challenge and look to meet it by 2030. You are a part of that, particularly if you have access or are looking to access Church of England funding. Understanding your role in that bigger picture is really important. And of course, energy audits will enable you to talk about, by making these changes, we reduce our energy consumption. By making these changes, we reduce our carbon emissions by X amount. We reduce our running costs for the next year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years by X pounds. That makes us more sustainable as a church. All of this stuff builds your credibility, which makes it more likely the funders and donors will trust you to do what you said you'll do. And the structure of your appeal, we've talked about lots of resources. We've talked about lots of information in this session. I'm going to just recommend 2 further resources to you. They're very practical and they're very fundraising focused, and they complement your funder research, finding who the funders are. We'd say that you'd need a gift pyramid and you need a rock and a hard place, and I'm going to explain what that is, because these tools help to answer the questions: how much can we raise and from where? So the gift pyramid, you may be familiar with this. We'll take the example of £1 million project just because the figures are round and it's easy to give an example. And we say, let's imagine that we need a gift of at least 10% of the total, and that's probably our opening gambit. That's our kind of, we know the project might be viable if we can get that first 10%. We have a table, we use Excel for this. It's quite easy to set it up because you have a column which says, what are the different sizes of gifts or grants or donations that we might receive? How many gifts might we get of that size? We multiply the 2 columns together and it gives us a total. And what we're trying to do in that bottom right appeal target box is get to our total of £1 million in this case. Use your own figures for your own project. And it's interesting how, as the gifts get smaller, the number that you need get larger to reach your target. And we've totalized from this example that we would need 82 unique gifts or donations or grants to reach our $1 million target. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about where do we find those 82 and do those 82 exist? But this is quite useful. We use this tool when we're speaking to congregations on behalf of the church. We don't ask congregation members for money, but we do have conversations with them about, if this project goes ahead, do you think you might support it financially? These are the kind of sums that might be needed. These are the range of gifts. Do you think this church has 82 contacts that could give money at different sources? And then crucially, we say to members of the congregation, do you see yourself anywhere in that left-hand column? Do you, might you give a gift anywhere in that scale? And it gets people thinking about their contribution before they've made it. Gets people thinking about, oh, well, no, I couldn't see myself at 10,000, but yeah, I might make a £5,000 gift, which helps us to feed back to the church anonymously that from the conversations we've had, your congregation might give these kinds of sums. So it is really useful. It can be totally fictional because all you're doing is trying to get that bottom right-hand target figure to work. So there's a bit of caution around this, but it is a helpful tool. Another one that we use is a pledge tally. So I talked earlier about somebody who may say, I can't give £1,000 up front. Well, maybe you could give it over 3 to 5 years. This little, again, Excel table that we use says in the central column, if you gave X amount monthly, £1, £2, £10, £100, if you then add gift aid, the right-hand column, which increases the gift by 25%, and then you multiply that up, 12 months times 5 years, the left-hand column says how much they would give. So if you said to a member of your congregation, £1 a month will over 5 years become £75, that might really empower somebody who feels like they've got nothing to give to your project to actually make that commitment. Now, of course, this needs to be over and above any regular giving that they're making, because you need to sustain your church and all its outgoings whilst the project is going on. So it's really important to stress that. However, this is just us trying to plan our fundraising appeal and where the money is going to come from, what might it look like, and maybe start to communicate some of that with others. And then the cryptically named rock and hard place, which my boss David sort of came up with a number of years ago. and living sort of between those two places. So on the left-hand side, we have what we call the rock. So this is the amount of money that we need to raise. Again, we've used the £1 million figure, just for example. And we've said the top figure, let's imagine we get one gift of that 10% or a grant or whatever it is. 100,000 times the one gift is £100,000. And then we sort of play around with some of the sizes of gifts and donations that feel reasonable. Maybe there's something at 75. Maybe there are two funders that could give us grants for £75,000. That's 150,000 in total, and so on and so forth. And we play around with those. In this scenario, again, purely speculatively, we've said, what if there are 41 gifts to get you to your £1 million? That's the rock. That would be a strong position to be in. Then we look at the hard place and we say, okay, where are these going to come from? Where's this £100,000 going to come from? Do we know an individual who might give us £100,000? And who might that be? At the £75,000, it's all very well to say 2 grants would make that possible. Can we find 2 grant funders interested in the type of work that we want to do that might achieve 2 grants for us? What about the different scales? We've said, what if there were 23 grants at different scales and different sizes? We've got to be able to find those through our research. We've got to go through the lists of funders and really work out, do those 23 funders exist at those different levels to enable us to move towards our target? And because every application is going to be successful, you might need to apply to 3 times that many. So, are there more than 60 grant funders that we can apply to in order to achieve the 23 grants that we're going to need? And you start to fill in the hard place based upon your research and see, is it valid? Is it real? Do we need to change some of the figures in our rock half of this table in order to achieve what we can? That's called a fundraising feasibility study. We do that kind of work with churches all the time. Slightly alternative version here, which is probably a bit more practical for a lot of churches, because we've broken some of the columns down. We've said, look, funds held, whatever that is, reserves, savings, whatever that looks like. Maybe there's £200,000 for this imaginary church. And then maybe they've got a building that they can sell that will yield another £200,000. So we know we've got that £400,000 in the bank. So now let's think about these other sources. We've put a column in for friends of. That would probably come under community fundraising traditionally, but it might be helpful to say, well, we know the friends have pledged to give £20,000 now or in the next 3 years or something, so we can put something in that column. And then we've done our grants research and identified a range of funders that can give £150,000 odd. Community groups, we may not know, but we may have a feeling from our past experience that around £5,000 might be possible. We're aware of a statutory grant for 20,000. And again, we're just going through and we're saying, let's stop imagining now what might be possible. Let's only start filling in the opportunities that we know are real, that we're finding, or that we are confident of. Because if that doesn't get you to your £1 million, £500,000, £100,000 target, you're going to struggle to raise your funds. And the worst thing is to start your fundraising only to find halfway that you can't raise the money that you need. Everything grinds to a halt. People who have given wondered what's happened to their money, and it's not a good place to be. So, a couple of quick words now as we draw to a close before question time. Thinking about time frame, churches often ask us how long do we need to plan. So some rules of thumb here, they're not set in stone, but your congregation, you probably know, is that 3 to 6 months to raise money? You'll probably have a better idea of that than we can. It's quite variable. I've heard of the church that invited donations and pledges up front from their congregation. One person said, yeah, I'll give £100,000. Everyone got very excited and that money never materialized. So you just need to be aware of the potential for that. I've heard of other churches, in fact, my own church certainly made plans for the pledges that they received. Yes, we think in the next 3 to 5 years from the pledges we've got, this is the amount we should have, and we can offset that against a loan. But also we're planning that a certain percentage might drop off their giving because they lose a job, they might move away, they might change churches. So thinking about attrition is an important part of your planning process. No hard and fast rules of that, but just something to think through what feels right to you. External individual donors, depends how warm they are, depends how much they know you and how likely they are to give. Maybe 3 to 12 months to introduce someone to the idea of your project outside of the church and warm them up to the point that you can ask them for a donation. Grant makers, if I apply today, I might get a response in 3 months, maybe 12 months, anything in between. They move quite slowly. And then once they give you a grant, they may well say, you've got 2 years to spend it, or else we want it back, please. So you need to think that through. Statutory funding, I've put 1 day to 3 months. You know, it's not unheard of that the statutory opportunity comes out and it's got a very short turnaround time, probably more than a day, but they can be really quite close. So you need your project ready to go at a moment's notice if you want to access statutory funding. Private companies are a bit like the external people, depends how warm they are to you and what that may look like. And your community fundraising might be continuous once it starts. Beware of fundraising fatigue, don't start too soon. So in other words, you're probably going to spend 9 to 12 months raising the funds you need for your project. And possibly longer due to the cyclical nature of PCC meetings, the decisions that have to be made that delay you getting on with your fundraising work, and the church calendar, what else is going on in the life of your church and community. To this reflection on the funding mix, yours is going to look different. Your rock and your hard place, your research is going to help you to work out what do these percentages look like and where's the money going to come from. So I'm just putting that back there to give you a sense of what typical might look like and you'll work yours out accordingly. And finally, fundraising is a team game, not a solo sport. Remember the pit lane. It's not all about the drivers. It's not only about the drivers of the racing car. They rely on their team around them. And I speak to loads of fundraisers who do the fundraising work on their own, and they feel a bit lonely, and they feel like everyone's looking to them and asking where the next grant's coming from. And actually, how can you support them to feel less lonely? And if you're the fundraiser, how can you keep talking about fundraising in a positive way to manage people's expectations and keep them on board? Equally, reaching net zero is a shared responsibility for your church, your community, for the Church of England, for all of us. And your project is not happening in isolation. Looking at case studies will help you to remember that, to see what else is happening, to see what good looks like, and to learn from success and mistakes.